I think that homelessness represents a broad band of people. In New Zealand, for example, there's an estimated 20,000 people who are homeless. Now, many of those are people that we don't see. People who are living in caravans or garages or multiple families in small homes or settings. The public sees homelessness as the solitary figure that's maybe sleeping under the bridge or under the stairs or walking with their belongings in the downtown area. And also that solitary figure appears to be struggling, maybe with mental health problems, maybe with addiction. That group of people represents a rather small percentage of the overall homeless population, maybe 10 or 20%. But in the public mind and in the media's mind, that is the picture of homelessness. It's often 80% of the time represented as homelessness. That group of people, the people who we call homeless, literally homeless or street-dwelling homeless, sometimes chronically homeless, all kinds of adjectives to describe the both extreme nature of their homelessness and also the duration of their homelessness. That group has, for a long time, evaded positive engagement with social services or housing services or any other kind of services. And that is the group that everyone is concerned about. Social services, the business community, the religious community, the soup kitchens. This is who everybody is seeing and serving. And they are sort of at the epicenter of everybody's attention. That is also the group that Housing First is designed to serve. Housing First is a permanent supportive housing program. It's a program that provides both housing and support services to people who are homeless and people who have complex needs, mental health, addiction needs, so that the person who qualifies for a Housing First program is someone who wouldn't be able to get out of homelessness on their own. They need the additional supports, and they need the supports once they're housed in order to make that housing successful. So that's the Housing First program. It provides both housing and supports to that group. And it does it in a rather unique way because it reverses the usual sequence that other programs use. Most programs require the person to be clean and sober, participate in treatment, and to somehow get ready for housing or demonstrate that they can keep it together so that they can give them housing. People have to earn it. Housing First doesn't have those requirements because we have found that people who are on the street and have these challenges can't earn it, no matter how hard they try, or don't see treatment as their priority. They see survival or housing as their priority and don't want to participate in treatment as a precondition for housing. So the services as usual approach has really failed many of the people who are on the street. That's why they're still on the street. The Housing First approach takes a different way of working with this very same group. And it basically invites the participant to define their priorities. That seems to work very well for people. People are very clear about what they want first, what they want second, and what they want third. And it usually follows the sequence of I want a place to live. So they go literally from the streets into a place of their own. We help them find housing as quickly as possible and then provide the support services they need after they're housed. The way the Housing First program evolved was by changing the clinical approach that we had assumed to be the right one. And it was really after a series of repeated failures that made us think that we need a different way to go. Because what we were trying to do was not working. Taking people to treatment when there was no housing at the end of treatment, only resulted in them coming back to the streets. People were not interested in repeating that cycle, and we began to have a dialogue with them in a kind of a joint effort to come up with a solution that would work. And I think the change was to really humble ourselves and to accept the limitations of the work we were doing as inadequate and work together to develop something that was more meaningful and more effective. And I think once we surrendered to that idea, we came up with something that was quite spectacular because it included the voice of the people we were working with. And together we designed an intervention that has proven to be extremely successful. So it does require a completely different point of view, a completely different approach than the traditional clinical services where the clinician is the expert and prescribes the treatment. It's a collaborative approach. It's an approach that also requires a certain value set in terms of not believing that people have to earn their way back to society, that people deserve a seat at the table right away, and it's up to us to provide the accommodations to make that possible for them. Housing as a basic human right is one of the premises of the program. And so it's a combination of a change of clinical approach and also based on a certain set of social justice values that support that approach. One of the reasons that Housing First is widely disseminated is that it's an evidence-based practice, which means that there is a great deal of research evidence about its effectiveness. It's been tested in clinical trials, much like a new medication would be tested. Some people get the old medication, some people get the new medication, some people get no medication at all, and then we see who does better in relieving the symptoms. The symptoms here are homelessness, mental illness, and addiction. And the treatment options are treatment, sobriety, housing versus housing first, treatment afterwards, or business as usual, soup kitchens, shelters, the chaos of the institutional circuit of homeless services. Now, the studies randomly assign people to these three conditions. And what we have found, studies in the United States, studies in Canada, studies in Europe, is that consistently the Housing First approach performs better in housing stability than anything else in homeless services by a very wide margin. Like 80% success in housing stability compared to the runner-up, which is around 40%. So these studies have been conducted by different universities, different researchers with different populations, different cultural contexts. So it's really rigorous in the sense of the stability and consistency of that finding. So when people are considering what is a useful intervention for this group of people, when you look at the research literature about what has proven effective other places, Housing First stands out as something that has been empirically tested and demonstrated to work time and time again. So there's a confidence to knowing that if you do this, you should expect results that look like 80% success everywhere you do it. And I think that's going to be the case here as well. There are a couple of rather spectacular examples of a large-scale implementation of Housing First, and also examples of where it's worked very, very well in rural communities. I mean, sometimes people think of Housing First as a very much an urban intervention, but it works frankly everywhere where you do it correctly. It just looks a little different. But let me give you a couple of examples where it's worked really well. One in the United States recently, there was a national initiative to end homelessness for veterans. And on the homelessness count in the US, they had found there were about 75,000 homeless veterans, literally homeless on the street. And the Veterans Administration and the US Housing and Urban Development departments collaborated to put the funding together for the rent and support services for these veterans. And in order to engage them from the street, they used an evidence-based approach, Housing First. And in 3 years that this has been going on, there has been a 56% reduction in veterans' homelessness in the States. And about 35 of the cities participating have actually brought that number down to 0 altogether. There are remaining veterans in some of the larger cities like Los Angeles, for example. New York reduced veterans' homelessness by 94%. So the Veterans Administration is keeping track because they want to make sure every veteran's off the street. So there's a great example of a really large-scale kind of implementation. And what we learned from that is if you have the resources, if you have the rent money, that will be able to find apartments for people who are homeless. And even though it's a tight housing market everywhere, it's true in Los Angeles, it's certainly true in Auckland, and it's true in every wonderful city actually. But every city can find a few hundred apartments and homelessness can be ended. That is consistently demonstrated everywhere where this thing is implemented. And the reason that that's true is that the numbers of people who are homeless, literally homeless, that we're talking about, is a very tiny number relative to the entire homeless population or the entire portfolio of rentable properties in a city. So it's simultaneously true that there isn't enough affordable housing, and also true that you can house a couple of hundred people in any city at any time if you have the rent money in place. Another rather dramatic example was the Canadian example. Recently, they did a 5-year study across 5 different cities: Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton, New Brunswick, coast to coast. About 2,200 people that had been chronically homeless and had mental health problems and addiction, the complex profile. Random assignment study. One person got Housing First, the other person got treatment as usual. 2-year follow-up. The results identical to the other studies that had been done. 80% roughly success for Housing First, 40% for treatment as usual. Here's what's interesting about that. The Canadian government had funded the study. They read the results and realized that if we actually know what to do about homelessness, we're going to change our policy so that if any program is providing homeless services, we're going to require them to actually provide an evidence-based practice. Why pay for a practice that we know will only deliver 40% success when we can pay the same money and have a practice that pays 80% success, delivers 80% success? So the federal policy now in Canada has shifted, as have the monies to support that policy. So if you're running a homeless services program in Canada, you have to spend 50% of your federal money on a Housing First approach. I've never seen that before. That's quite unprecedented and I think very smart, going from research to policy to funding to implementation. And I think maybe if New Zealand is not careful, the Canadians may be the first country to end chronic homelessness. But I do think New Zealand has a leg up because, the total number here of street homelessness is in the hundreds, not in the thousands like it is there. So there is a tremendous advantage to the fact that the magnitude of the problem is smaller here. The program has 5 principles, and they are more or less based on what we know from clinical work, the importance of self-determination and empowerment, for example, as a healing, psychological healing approach to working. So choice, client choice, is a foundational principle of the program. And then we've learned some things operationally about housing and services. So the second principle is about separating housing from services. What that does is that if the person, for example, loses their apartment or is in an apartment and has to be hospitalized, or if they're arrested and they go to jail, the fact that the services are separate from the housing allows the team to continue to support the person through housing disruptions. Or if they move into a bigger place because their family joined them, the team can continue to be there as well. So a commitment to the person is what that second principle speaks to. Not a commitment to the housing. The housing is just something the person is living in at the time. The commitment is to the person through all of the different types of housing they may require. Another principle is called service matching, which means that if you're going to house people with a lot of complicated needs, you're going to have to make sure that you're providing the support services adequate to meet those needs. You can't put someone in housing and then just go see them once a month if they're struggling actively with addiction or mental health problems. You have to visit them as much as necessary to make that tenancy successful. So that's a principle where you match those services. A fourth principle is called recovery oriented services, which blends into figuring out ways to help people not only succeed in housing, but to get their lives back. That they have a life that's not all about treatment or all about their symptoms, that they have a life that includes family and spirituality and citizenship and employment and, a real life like the rest of us, recovery. And so the services are not only narrowly focused on just the core treatment issues, but have a wider, more holistic approach. And the fifth one is community integration, which we think people should be living in housing of their choice and in the community like everybody else. And we support the kind of housing which is your own place in the community, not a specialized housing, not in housing for these people kind of an approach. But it's not our choice, really. I mean, if the person wants to live in that kind of housing, supportive housing, we would honor that. It's really honoring their options. The community integration refers to the broader inclusion of people. These principles are about human rights, housing as a human right, self-determination, care over time, intent to treat. They are more or less universal principles. The way that the program looks in different countries and different cultures is adjustable. The principles can be consistent, but the way that it's manifest can look different. For example, Maori culture, whanau, other principles of family and connectedness are a core part of that culture. And so the idea of an apartment of your own may not be exactly the right housing intervention. People want to live with their family, not individual. So that the program would have to figure out how to accommodate the person's choice for that lifestyle. So it would be finding places where families can be together, for example, or the approach to recovery is not necessarily a Western mental health approach, but more of a holistic, spiritually guided approach that is culturally relevant to the people that we're dealing with. So that the actual implementation of the program can be sensitive to the cultural and local norms, but the self-determination and choice and housing as a right principles can still be intact and guide the implementation of that program in that context. People are in Housing First programs for different lengths of time, depending on how their life unfolds. I mean, sometimes people who have been homeless for a long time have been almost in hiding from their families. They don't want their families to know that they're homeless, too painful. They've been really keeping families at bay. And then the person gets housed and they come out of the woodwork and they let their families know, I've got a place, so there's reconnection, and the family says, come back, let's. So that would be a very short term. People won't maybe need the program support for a very long time. Other people don't have that kind of connection, don't have that family support, don't have that same relationship. So they end up needing the support of the team for quite some time. Many people need the rent support for a longer period of time than they need the case management support, because people don't get out of poverty as quickly as they recover from addiction or even mental health problems. So that the graduation looks different depending on the resources the person has available to them in the community. And it also looks different depending on how quickly they can get out of poverty. We as a program anticipate that we will be there for the person for as long as they need us, and then that need us time is determined by their progress. The program has proven to be very successful 80% of the time, and that still leaves 20% of the people that don't succeed in the program. And that is continues to be a challenge to figure out what is the best way to help people that this program doesn't seem to work for. We have learned a few things about it, which is that it's a rather flexible and unstructured program. And one of the ways that people typically don't succeed is that they can't manage their tenancy. I mean, the support services can be there and be as supportive as possible, but it does require that the person meets the terms and conditions of a standard lease. If we're getting them an apartment, they actually have to manage it the same way that everybody else in the building is managing that apartment. For some people, the transition from homelessness into housing is made very difficult by the fact that when they were homeless in a group. They were homeless with 3 or 4 other people that they had come to trust. And that group of people is not a group that they can leave. And for some reason, one of the 4 gets an apartment. And it's not possible to say no to having people come over that have watched you, protected your stuff, protected your life on the street, shared their food with you. What happens is that even though you're supposed to house only one person, the group moves in, and that becomes a lease violation. Too many people in the apartment, they could be using, it becomes disruptive, and there's an eviction. And that happens several times, and the person isn't able or willing to make that shift of lifestyle, very difficult. And so they need some other kind of arrangement. I mean, either everybody gets housed, or they are housed in a different type of program where someone else is controlling the front door because they can't say no to their friends, but the program is saying no to their friends. But we need some other options for that 20% that isn't doing well in the program. And I don't know that there's a one solution for that whole group, but we need to consider what is creating the failure, and are there ways that we can somehow address that more effectively. The role of government is key here, because this is a long-term intervention that requires both a rent subsidy and money for the case management. So I think that the government actually is in a position to make a decision about exactly what scale of housing first they want to do. I mean, it's key to have government funding because this is long-term commitment. You can't fundraise or do foundation work. You can for some particular complementary projects, but this is bread and butter. And I think that the role of government is essential. I mean, even in the initiative that is funded now, you know, 3 million from the new government and $1 million from the council is exactly the kind of funding that you would need to put together. It's a relatively small amount given the magnitude of the problem, but it's a great start, and it is a pilot. But the role of government is essential in two ways. I think certainly providing the funding, but I think the government should also be mindful of the intervention and making sure that what they're paying for is what they're getting, so that they want to assure that these are in fact Housing First programs, that we are in fact getting the 80% success that we're paying for. And I think that requires a kind of a commitment not only to the money, but technical assistance or training support so that everybody is working the model, you know, the way that we know it can deliver the results we want. The wider community is public opinion. And I think one of the reasons we've had homelessness for a long time is that there hasn't been a lot of public awareness about homelessness in general and effective solutions in particular. But I think that if we can get the word out that this does not have to be this way, that there is a solution and we can do something about it, and to get the public energized into advocating for it, the public is ultimately going to create the political will to have council and government listen, because this will be not acceptable. Somehow we have lost the urgency that is so evident in a child walking by a homeless person. Children can't tolerate walking by a homeless person. It's too painful for them. Like, why is this person here, they ask. And we have taught them to look away. It's not polite. And I think that is a disservice, not only to shutting down the kid's natural, spontaneous human response, but also our own, and also contributing to having that person remain on the street. We have to get back to that sense of there's a person out here. This is a crisis. We have to do something about this now. That is the role of the public, to be urgent about solving this, because we can. Ending homelessness in New Zealand is absolutely achievable. We've seen it happen in all kinds of cities and states, and size matters. So because New Zealand is a country of a manageable size and can muster political will, and is demonstrated to do that historically time and time again, you have a problem that can be nipped in the bud now before it grows. And I think, starting with prioritizing people who are chronically homeless will generate the results and hopefully the initiative to take this on and absolutely end homelessness in New Zealand.